If you think about how we're in the middle of a pandemic, and then you take how racialized our society is, a lot of us are walking around with low-grade anxiety or depression. We're feeling, in many ways, just disoriented. And I'm really thinking that the church needs a reclamation. And it's that reclamation of joy and also celebration. But it's not this kind of like joyous, celebration, naivete celebration, where a mob of people come together to worship with no masks on. I think, frankly, God will have something to say about that. And we look at the book of Micah, and we know how God felt about noisy, joyous celebrations that ignored the plight of the least, the last, the lost, the most vulnerable, and those who maybe have pre-existing conditions, maybe those who have a comorbidity of factors that puts them at risk, right? So that's a specific type of worship. But when I think about joy, it comes from this authentic place that I believe is just kind of the flip side of suffering. And in many ways, you look at our African American tradition, which is really American history, and how the historical Black church, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of experiencing real indignities at the hands of not only the government, but also the state, the police, people, somehow, some way, in the church space, in the beloved community, they were able to live out a type of worshipful resistance that took an honest assessment of what was happening in the world, took an honest assessment of Jim Crow, took an honest assessment that there were lynchings happening, they took an honest assessment of segregation, and I could go on. And yet, through the hope of the gospel, by the way, that they were given in a distorted form, they were somehow able to reclaim it and find, in a sense, a song and a story of liberation, even in the midst of, in the shadow of American empire, which is what it is and what it was. And it harkens back in many ways to when I think about the Exodus narrative and the liberation narrative, when they crossed the Red Sea, the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea. The first thing, and this was a woman-led celebration, the first thing they do is they celebrate, and Miriam begins to sing, and they begin to sing songs of celebration that were actually connected and not disembodied from slavery and their oppression and the story of making bricks without straw and all those kinds of things. So even the celebration, right, the heavenly celebration was rooted in a story and a communal memory of suffering, yet God in the midst of it show God's self strong in that. And I think that's where the joy comes. It's not through bypassing or glossing over trauma, but it's in taking it on courageously and inviting the Spirit, inviting God into that place of trauma, inviting community, because it's not something that you do alone, and allowing your trauma to be transformed into, like the old church used to say, it becomes eventually the testimony. And it could be a living testimony. You know, it's not one of those like, this is where I was, this is where I am, everything's all good. But in our days, we're living through complex grief with all the images that we see in the world, social media, modern day lynchings, police killings. We're people that are experiencing grief. And I think the greatest act of resistance is when we can claim joy in our black bodies, in our brown bodies, in our Asian bodies, in our Native American bodies, in bodies that have been ostracized and marginalized. But Christ loves everybody.